It started as a rock. In parts of the ancient Mediterranean, miners pulled a deep red ore from the ground called cinnabar. When people heated it, something baffling happened. The red mineral seemed to sweat out a bright, silvery liquid. It flowed, then gathered itself back together, almost like it had a will. They called it living silver. It looked like metal, but it moved like water. That alone made it unforgettable. This new substance, mercury, did not fit the everyday rules people trusted. Most metals stayed solid. Mercury refused. It slid into cracks, split into beads, then merged again without effort. To early craftsmen and traders, that behavior mattered more than any theory. It made mercury rare, hard to store, and easy to lose. It also made it valuable as a curiosity. People handled it to test it, not to swallow it. So in this first chapter, mercury did not arrive as a cure or a promise. It arrived as a problem and a marvel at the same time. A metal that acted alive. It travelled in small amounts, passed between hands as a thing to show, to wonder at, and to use carefully in limited tasks. The big idea that it might unlock health or long life did not drive this era. Mystery drove it. As Greek and Roman medicine travelled, it carried a new habit. Substances got sorted, compared, and prescribed. Mercury stopped being only a curiosity and became a candidate. It behaved unlike any other metal. It flowed, it slipped through fingers, it vanished into fumes and returned again. To early natural philosophers, that meant it had hidden properties. And hidden properties sounded like medicine. Healers watched what mercury did to the body in small, risky trials. It irritated. It purged. It drove saliva. In a medical world that valued clearing out what was thought to be harmful, those violent effects looked like proof of action, not proof of danger. The logic stayed simple. If it forced a strong reaction, it must have reached deep inside. The uncanny metal started to feel useful. At the same time, craftsmen used mercury for practical work, pulling gold onto surfaces, separating precious material, making mixtures that behaved in surprising ways. Those workshop results fed back into healing claims. If mercury could draw out gold and change metals, people assumed it might also draw out disease and change flesh. A new idea took hold. Power over matter might mean power over life. The boundary between cure and craft blurred. In late antiquity, a new kind of practice took shape, alchemy. It did not treat mercury as just another odd material. It treated it as a key. Mercury's most startling trick, shifting between liquid and solid, grabbing onto other metals, then seeming to let go, looked like proof that matter was not fixed. If metal could be loosened and remade, then change felt possible on command. As alchemical writing spread into the early Islamic world, mercury moved from ingredient to principle. Alchemists described metals as if they were built from deeper foundations, and mercury sat at the center of that picture. They mixed and heated it, combined it with sulfur-like substances, and watched colors, textures, and weights change. Each reaction looked like a clue. Mercury started to stand for the very idea that metals had hidden structures. That shift mattered. If mercury represented a foundation of metal itself, then controlling mercury promised control over transformation. The goal was not a single lucky trick, but a repeatable pathway. Purify the principles, balance them, and drive base matter toward a perfected form. Mercury became the workhorse of that hope. It carried the theory and it powered the experiments, and it redefined what change could mean. In medieval Latin Europe, translated alchemical manuals arrived like toolkits. They carried recipes, diagrams of steps, and a promise matter could be improved. Mercury sat at the centre of that promise because it behaved like no other metal. It flowed, it vanished as vapour, then returned as droplets. Alchemists treated that changeability as a clue. If mercury could shift forms so easily, then other substances might be pushed to higher states too. Experiments turned practical and repetitive. Mercury got heated with minerals, ground with salts, washed and distilled again and again in cycles meant to strip away impurity. Each round felt like progress because the material visibly changed. Colours appeared, powders formed, liquids condensed. The goal was not a single trick, but control. Purification became the first victory, and once purification seemed possible, transmutation stopped sounding like a fantasy and started sounding like a delayed result. These practices spread beyond isolated tinkerers. Courts supported work that hinted at wealth because improved metals suggested improved coinage. Monasteries copied procedures because reliable methods fit their habits of record and routine. Small laboratories formed around patrons, scribes and craftsmen, all chasing what texts called perfected substances. Mercury-based work promised a ladder from flawed matter to refined matter. It never delivered certainty, but it did deliver momentum, and that momentum kept the experiments alive. By the Renaissance, the promise around mercury stopped sounding like mere metalwork and started sounding like salvation. The old dream of turning base metals into gold stayed alive, but a bigger claim pushed in beside it, that the same substance might restore the human body. Writers and experimenters treated mercury as more than an ingredient. They treated it as a shortcut to renewal, a tool that might push age itself backward. That belief changed how people used it. Mercury no longer sat only in crucibles and closed vessels. It entered medicine chests, it got prepared as pills, mixed into tinctures, or driven into white powders called sublimates, then swallowed or rubbed onto skin. The reasoning sounded simple. If mercury could break down and rebuild matter, it might purge sickness and rebuild strength. The body became the new site of transmutation. But the results did not match the hope. People noticed mouth sores, shaking hands, loosened teeth, and minds that seemed to slip. Some still interpreted these effects as proof the treatment worked, as if suffering meant impurities left the body. The language of an elixir of life grew louder even as damage became harder to deny. Mercury promised rejuvenation, then quietly collected a toll. In the early modern period, mercury stopped being mainly a workshop hope and became a physician's tool. A new disease pushed it forward, syphilis. It spread fast, it looked frightening, and no one knew a reliable cure. Doctors watched mercury do something that felt like action, so they reached for it again and again. The promise changed tone. It no longer sounded like eternal life. It sounded like treatment. Physicians gave mercury in many forms, rubbed into the skin, swallowed in preparations, or breathed in as vapour during sweating cures. The goal was simple: force the body to react. Salivation became a sign they were winning, because it proved the medicine was powerful. But the line between effect and injury vanished quickly. Mouths ulcerated, teeth loosened, gums rotted, patients weakened. The cure announced itself by harming the patient. Still, mercury therapy spread because doctors needed something they could claim worked, and because some symptoms did seem to fade, at least for a time. That appearance of success made the practice mainstream. Mercury moved from rare experimental substance to routine prescription, and once it entered everyday medicine, It carried alchemy's old confidence into clinics, but without its caution. What began as a hope for transformation ended as an accepted brutal bargain. By the 1600s, something shifted. People still used mercury, but the old promises started to sound thin. A new kind of investigator treated it less like a secret key and more like a material with rules. They heated it, weighed it, trapped its vapors, and wrote down what changed and what did not. The question stopped being, could mercury perfect life? It became, what did mercury reliably do? As experiments multiplied, mercury's effects separated into clear categories. It moved through the body in ways that looked dramatic, sometimes forcing sweating or salivation, sometimes calming a symptom, sometimes making the patient worse. Those outcomes could be repeated, measured, and compared. The mystical language of an elixir did not predict any of that. It could not explain dose, timing, or why one person improved and another declined. That change mattered because authority moved with it, a claim no longer won simply by sounding ancient or profound. It had to survive tests and match results. Mercury kept its place in medicine and in the lab, but now under a harsher light. When it helped in limited ways. When it harmed, the harm became harder to deny. The elixir story weakened, not by argument, but by outcomes. In the 19th century, mercury stopped being mostly a cabinet chemical and became an industrial tool. Factories and workshops demanded speed and consistency, and mercury delivered both. It helped metals join, it helped surfaces shine, and it helped processes run the same way every day. But the change that mattered most was scale. More jobs used it, more people handled it, and exposure stopped being rare. In hat making, mercury nitrate hardened felt and made mass production possible. Workers breathed fumes and touched treated materials for hours, day after day. Over time, bodies reacted in ways that seemed like personality changes at first. Shaking hands, slurred speech, irritability, and sudden fear. These were not just private illnesses, they were patterns inside the same shops, spreading across the same benches and shifts. Mining and manufacturing widened the problem even further. Mercury got used where ores were processed and where equipment was built, and it escaped as vapor or as spilled liquid that lingered. Whole crews showed the same decline, and families noticed what work did to workers. The new realization arrived by force. Mercury poisoning did not only harm an individual, it could shape an entire workplace and then a community. In the 20th century, mercury stopped being mainly a workplace problem and became a public threat. It moved through air and water, and it ended up in people who never handled it. Scientists measured it in blood and hair, then connected those numbers to real damage, shaking hands, numb fingers, lost vision, and brains that did not develop normally. The old question changed. It was no longer what mercury could do for you, it was what it did to you. Major contamination disasters forced that lesson into the open. Mercury released into waterways entered fish, then climbed the food chain, concentrating at each step. Families ate what looked like normal food and paid with lifelong injury. Children suffered the most because small doses mattered more in growing bodies. Modern toxicology explained why. Mercury came in different forms, and some crossed into the brain and the womb with ease. The danger did not require huge amounts, it required time. Once the mechanism became clear, the response shifted from treatment to prevention. Governments set exposure limits, restricted industrial releases, and pushed safer replacements in products that had quietly depended on mercury for decades. Medicine backed away from routine mercury use and demanded proof that any benefit outweighed harm. A new consensus settled in. Mercury remained useful in narrow cases, but it never became harmless. Even when the gain looked small, the risk stayed real, and it stayed measurable. By the time today arrived, Mercury no longer sat on the edge of mystery. It sat on lists. It got measured, tracked, restricted. Governments treated it less like a useful material and more like a risk that travelled. In products, Mercury got phased out where it could. When it stayed, it came with rules, labels, and disposal plans. The old promise shrank to a hard question. How much exposure was too much? Medicine shifted the fastest. Mercury stopped being a routine remedy and became a last resort, then mostly a warning. Doctors relied on safer drugs, and public health guidance focused on avoiding harm rather than chasing cures. The logic changed. A treatment no longer worked because it did something dramatic to the body. It worked because it helped more than it hurt in controlled doses, with clear evidence. Mercury rarely passed that test. The environment forced the final rewrite. Mercury moved through air, water, and food chains, so prevention mattered as much as cleanup. Monitoring programs sampled fish, tested soil, and traced emissions back to sources. Advisories told families which seafood to limit, especially during pregnancy and childhood, when damage lasted. This was the collapse of the elixir idea in plain terms. Mercury did not extend life. It threatened it unless people proved, controlled, and prevented.